I don't know if I even disagree with what the essential thesis of this was, but I'm bringing it up because I found that it brought me up to an essential tangent, the meaning of what matzah ashira and matzah lechem oni means. So I'm going to put this up on the screen for your viewing pleasure. This is from a recent issue of Hakira, which is one of the rabbinic journals they have out in the States. I've recently they ran something that I had written in which surprisingly Rabbi Turiel disagreed with my essential thesis. Well, I think maybe you disagree with two of the essential theses. The first one was that from a Talmudic perspective, perhaps those who are about to be deceased cannot actually somehow waive the requirement for their surviving relatives to mourn for them. That was the first thesis. And the second was, and what should be the normative halacha? Certainly, Rabbi Tzurio believed that there was perhaps Talmudic basis to have this ruling, but whatever it is normative halacha to do so, and that's what he himself tried to do. As we found out eventually, yeah, but his children still ended up sitting shiva for him and observing the shloshim, if not already. I don't know what they're doing now these current months, but I would like to see. So here, Mitchell first, who's has a PhD. I think he also might have smicha also. And I was first introduced to his writings through this paper over here, Jewish History and Conflict. I think it was his doctoral thesis, which he turned into his first book. So I discovered this book about 3 years after it was published in 97, and it was actually quite eye-opening. What's it talking about? The missing 166 years that we've mentioned a few times, about which eventually I got, I think, quite satisfactory answers from Rabbi Beryl Wein and Rabbi Stav out in KBY. So at the time, that was more of a surprise to me. So here he's looking into this idea, did the Israelites eat matzah while they were slaves? What is explicit in the Torah is that the Israelites were commanded before the first Passover offering, the one that precipitated the plague of the firstborn, they were supposed to consume their Passover offerings in Egypt with matzah, or masoth, as it says. And it says afterwards in the narrative that they happened to have made another batch of matzos when they left Egypt because, the classic story, they had their kneading troughs with them and they had no time to let it rise, so they just baked it on the fly. And that story of the kneading troughs actually occurs twice in Exodus. It says they took their kneading troughs, and then it says a few verses later, and they ended up baking it on the run. And in the book of Deuteronomy, at the end of what we call Parshas Re'eh, it's also mentioned we eat matzah because of chipazon. They did it. They were in a rush, and they've been told they would be in a rush, and that's how they actually had to eat their Passover offerings that very first time, which is not an eternal commandment. Eat it with their loins girded and with their walking sticks in their hand, as though they have to get up and go. Okay, so we know that they ate matzah that very night, and the question is, did they also have the habit of eating matzah beforehand? Now, I've seen other material, scholarly material, that seems to indicate that indeed that is what the Israelites ate. They specifically ate their bread unleavened, unlike the native Egyptians who had developed the technology to actually make proper leavened bread. They had different types of ovens, and they had a whole practice of letting the bread rise, where it was a traditionally Hebrew way of eating unleavened bread. And the Hebrews also happened to eat things like sheep, which the Egyptians did not, and they considered that repulsive. Why? Because that was their god. Okay, so I've seen that before. But here he's even questioning this very idea. What does it mean that our ancestors ate matzah in the land of Egypt? So was that habitual, or was it a one-time thing? So he goes into one essential point here, which is the definition of, or the meaning of Lechem Oni. And he offers a few ideas: poor bread, he says, bread that is without leaven or other specific ingredients that make it rise or otherwise improve its texture or flavor, or bread that is of low quality in a general sense. And he has a footnote here for Lechem Oni, and he cites these Talmudic passages. Those are where you could find the word oni or oni. What does the word oni mean? Really, the word is oni, and that's usually if it's the end of a sentence or if it's a standalone word, it's oni, mil'el, accent on the first syllable, and with a cholam. And if it's in the spichut form, then it's with a chatof kamatz, and it's accented on the second syllable or not accented at all. It's like connected with a makaf to the next word. Now, I find it funny that he offers this one first, and this is the one that you might find in the Talmud, and then it continues here with other ideas. He says, "How do we choose between these approaches?" And he whatever idea he's trying to bring out of this. Now, I wanted to point out that whatever it is that this definition, the first one he said, poor bread, I think that's the best one, and I also think that's the one that's actually recognized by the halacha. Why is that? What's the proof? Well, you look at these Talmudic passages. It's not just Talmudic passages that are saying this. These are the ones that are brought to halacha. There is an essential nafka mina halacha that says that your bread shouldn't just be the bread upon which you, let's say, answer a lot of questions from the shorish ayin nun silent hey, for example. People know that one. Lechem Oni malav devarim. How do you know that lechem oni means poor bread lahalacha, and it has to be that way? What's the halacha? The halacha is that it says in Devarim that you're supposed to eat. We mentioned this before. Tochalav masoth lechem oni. You should eat upon it masoth that are lechem oni. The halacha says, and this is brought in the poskim, that therefore one does not discharge his obligation to eat matzah on the first night of Passover unless the matzah is halachically lechem oni. Not all matzahs are lechem oni. Oh, okay, that's a good one. What?
Flavored ones.
Yeah, what's called the opposite of matzah that's lechem oni is matzah shira.
Which is why it has to taste like
Yeah,
matzah.
yeah. Matzah shira is halachically matzah. It's kosher for Passover. Yet, and this is an important part, yet you have to eat matzah that's halachically lechem oni on the first night to discharge your obligation. So what is matzah that's halachically lechem oni? By the way, that's a little bit of an argument. The basic approach is that matzah made with anything but flour and water. You add oils, they usually say fruit juices, oils, eggs, wine. Those are the usual things to make it a combination thereof, make what's called matzah shira. So one cannot discharge his obligation with the matzah that's halachically matzah shira. By the way, the same thing that makes matzah rich, matzah shira, is what would, let's say, turn bread from being stam bread with a bread taste or a savory taste if you add salt, etc., and what we call cakes and cookies or pathaba bekisanin. The second you start putting in, if you were to just, let's say, mix flour with, like what we do here, chocolate, a drop of salt, and eggs and oil, what do you get? A brownie, right? So that's a possible bekisnin. So that's technically matzah shira. So the point is that when Chazal said lechem oni, they realized that was pshat. I don't think it's. I think that any other interpretation of what lechem oni means, although there are those offered by Chazal and offered by the Rishonim, the one that is the pshat that is recognized by the halacha and is demanded by halacha is that it be lechem oni, okay? Bread that is poor, and it means the ingredients. And by the way, there's a proofs to this that matzah and poor bread are not synonymous. There are those who wanted to say they offered a pshat, which I think is a little bit contestable, just to say the least. Why? They said that just the fact that it's unleavened is already makes it poor. The disproof to that is this week's parasha and last week's parasha, according to the annual cycle, that is. What do we find in this week's parsha and last week's parsha, and what we were learning about a few months ago here? That there are two things mentioned halachically. Matzah is required by the Torah in two realms. The first is Chag HaMatzoth, the Passover festival, the festival of matzahs, literally, when you're supposed to eat matzah, right? So you have to know what? Yeah, in the temple, everything in the temple has to be unleavened. So it says in this week's parsha saying that a grammatical construct that's a little bit difficult for people if they miss it or they haven't studied it. It says here, matzot te'achel. Okay, matzot means, the plural of unleavened breads, right? That's a plural, and it says te'achel, it shall be eaten, and that's a female singular. So if the antecedent of te'achel was the matzot, it should be te'achelna or te'achalna, right? So what does this mean? No, it's saying that the bread of this meat offering, okay, which is the noteret mimena, that is from the meal offering. The Kohen takes out a kometz, burns it on his back, and the majority, what's left, is turned into a form of bread, like we saw, to be eaten, right? So it's saying that noteret, which is a singular, by the way, should be eaten as matzot. Matzot in this case is not a noun, a plural feminine noun. Matzot in this case means in the state of being matzah. That is, no, I'm trying to say that it's in the state of unleavened. Being matzah means unleavened, and it should be eaten. That's why, once again, we go back to the singular. The noteret should be eaten in the state of matzot. Matzot in this case is like an adjective. That's what we're going to get at. Hold on. And it says lo te'afeh chametz, and it shouldn't be baked as leaven. So chametz and matzot are actually opposites. Chametz is like an adjectival form, even though it's technically a verb. But those verbs, which instead of having in the singular a cholam, they have a kametz there, like tzameh and ra'ev and chametz, right? The rest of them, hungry and thirsty, or savea means you're full, satiated. So in this case, chametz is more of an adjective-like form, right? It explains it's a state of form. So too, matzot is the opposite of that. It has to be eaten in the state of unleavened and not eaten leavened. And as we know, the menachos were technically matzah shira. Why were they so rich? Because they were made with oil. They were made with poshrin, warm water, and olive oil. They had a very high olive oil content, as we've seen. So all of these, or the vast majority of these, what do you call it? The vast majority of these meal offerings in the temple were halachically matzah shira.
But these matzot shira that they used in the kohenot, they were more like pitot, which are pleasant to eat.
So actually, there were 5 ways to eat them. Okay, not including lechem aponim. So there's actually a lot of ways to eat this. And by the way, matzah is, and as we've learned in previous years, there's no one way to bake a matzah. Just because we're mostly familiar with cracker matzahs doesn't mean that that's the way that was done. As a matter of fact, that's very recent in history that matzahs are.
Perhaps because the matzah we have now is so unpleasant for most people to eat. Maybe that is.
No, because matzah doesn't have anything to do with the way you bake it, like the Rambam points out. Whether or not a bread product is matzah or chametz depends on what you do before the baking. Do you let it rise or not? That's the difference. That is the only difference. The ingredients can be the same. One is all flour and water. The other one's all flour and water. This one rose. This one did not. This is flour and everything under the sun except for water, and so too is that one, right? And technically, you could add yeast to this and leaven it. And this one, it won't leaven, which, by the way, is another point. If there's absolutely no water in the mix, scientific fact, and the halacha says that, of course, it'll come out as matzah, cannot leaven. And that's a matzah shira. Fine. So this parsha proves that point, that whereas in Leviticus, you have to make all the meal offerings into some form of unleavened bread, of which we've seen a few examples, it's specifically what we would call matzah shira. Whereas in Devarim, Deuteronomy, we're told what? The matzahs that you eat have to be pure. The exact opposite. So matzah doesn't mean, when it says lechem oni, it doesn't mean yes. It means it's synonymous with unleavened bread. No, that's what matzah means. Matzah is, when it says lechem oni, it means, and that unleavened bread should be pure and not have be matzah shira. A side point, and by the way, and the second point of this is that the richest bread cannot become leaven. If you were to really enrich your bread, like I said, you only put in eggs, oil, and fruit juice into the mix with your flour, it cannot leaven. You'll get just a really rich cake, as they say. That's the first thing. And also, there's a technical point over here that it's worth, for 5 points on the next test. And that is the Rambam's opinion regarding this. He's a little bit more nuanced. In the 5th chapter of Chametz Matzah, before he disqualifies it's in the 5th chapter. It disqualifies anything but water used to knead the dough. Right? He says if you're the matzah that you're going to use for the night of the Seder cannot be kneaded with anything but water. You can only use water. But then in the 6th parak, what does he have? He has a qualification. He wants to distinguish between most juices and oils, That's one thing, and eggs. Most juices, oils, and eggs on one hand, and olive oil, honey, and wine on the other, and milk. Okay. What? No, no, not. But aside from that, the Yad Shachat Dam, yes, those are the actual mashkin. The ones on the left are other oils and other fruit juices, and the ones on the right are the actual ones that have significance with regards to machshirin. Correct. But he points out that if you were to knead your matzah with a combination of, or any component of, without water, wine, olive oil, honey, or milk, you get real matzah shira, which cannot be used for the Seder period. You use that made a real rich matzah. That's not lechem oni. Whereas the first category, other juices and other oils, let's say your ghetto, so you're going to use orange juice or apple juice and eggs or canola oil, right? That's what you have at your disposal. All of those should not be used to knead your matzah before the fact. You be using water, not those. But if you did use those, the matzah that you have is still considered lechem oni after the fact to discharge your obligation. Okay, so that's the distinction. Others don't make that distinction. They say all of these are matzah shira. Now that's a big nafkamina. You know why? Because a lot of the matzah shiras on the market, I'm assuming they're kosher, by the way. I'm also this is, I guess, everybody in the world disagrees with me, but I think there's no problem eating matzah shira on Pesach. The old minhagim, similar to the minhag of no, even on the first night, you just can't discharge your obligation, but they shouldn't be forbidden. Okay, so that's a different story. We could see that, but that doesn't interest me so much to go into it in depth. The point is, in America, they have, let's say, Streit's matzahs or the Manischewitz egg matzahs. What are they made with? So some they're made with eggs, and they're also kneaded with apple juice. So according to the Rambam, those aren't as ashira as, for example, the ones made with wine. The ones made with wine or grape juice really are matzah shira, and a person could not discharge his obligation after the fact with those on Leil Pesach, Leil Seder. Whereas the first kind, the apple juice ones, just eggs and apple juice, technically speaking, one could discharge his obligation. And perhaps that would be a good, just like they say, they put a disclaimer on the package. You've seen the packages like in America, at least when I was younger. The packages say it's kosher for Passover and has a nice Ashkenazic rabbi giving the hechsher. They say it's only for sick people or the elderly. That's for our children, and to eat all the time, by the way, all Passover, limited for those who have a special dispensation. So there's a lot of chumras that have developed over the course of the years surrounding all different types of egg matzah, starting with Rashi, which, by the way, his chumrah wasn't accepted by his own grandchildren, but things have basically they devolved around that. That basically, like, you just have to hold, like, most Machon opinion that, on the contrary, all sorts of egg matzah, so-called egg matzah, matzah shira, rich matzah, is all non-kosher for Passover, basically. Michumra. Yeah, we'll go into that maybe next week, I think.
I know that there are people who don't eat it. So
yeah.
As far as I knew, there are people that do. It's funny to tell somebody.
Well, there are people that do. Yeah. One of the other things is that here in Israel, it became, I think I talked about this last year, let's say among communities where they never had a custom to avoid. By the way, I'm not saying that all customs are legitimate or illegitimate. Just trying to say that's the practice on the ground. There are many who say that, oh, you shouldn't be eating matzah shira. So there were places where they traditionally had matzah shira. Then they said, but the way it's made in the factory, now it's actually quite a problem and you shouldn't eat it. The so-called papachado problem. The papachado cookie factory, it's French owned, obviously. French family, Sephardic. They started this, and apparently, even though there is no water in the mix, they're using fruit juices and oils and eggs to make their matzah shira. Still, it's not good enough. They say that, how do you know it's completely water-free in the mix? So I think that's a little bit of a stretch, because Chazal said that if you use a combination of water and oils or water and juices, you could end up leavening. They meant significant amounts of water. As a matter of fact, it's actually a chemistry problem. How much water does it take in the mix to allow the leavening to once again occur? Because ordinary fruit juices prevent leavening. Why? What's the difference? Apple juice is mostly water, right? The acidity, it's the pH. And also, does apple juice have the same pH as orange juice and the same as grape juice, let's say? No, they all have their own. So obviously, there's a certain amount of dilution based on what you're using and how much salt you have in the mix, et cetera, and how much eggs and oil you put in that actually makes this determination. But they were at a chashash of droplets of water from the cleaning of the machines. So that's rachok from this thing. That's why I don't think it's such a crazy thing, but whatever. By the way, that's the point we have here, that matzah ashira is possible, and it's 100% matzah. And when the Torah requires us to eat both matzah and lechem oni, those are two separate conditions. Matzah means not leavened, and lechem oni lahalacha means it should be made ideally without any oils and juices, etc., to make it rich, which is the exact opposite of what was required in the temple, where copious amounts of oil were required, and the results were matzah that was always rich.
We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. If you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.